my talk is based on the book, which was published on the basis of the course in the International Law Academy in The Hague, which I gave in January 2019. And the pocket book appeared in the spring of 2021. It is about animals in international law. If we look at the facts, we should note that the biggest group of animals living on the globe are 450 billion land animals confined for food anytime. And per year, roughly 58 billion land animals are slaughtered, and the same amount of sea animals. The second group of animals used for research is much smaller. The number of agricultural animals is 4,000 to 5,000 times as many animals used for food than for research. The research animals, estimated 126 to 150 million animals used worldwide each year, are mostly rodents, about 70% mice. The third group of animals, wildlife, is by far the smallest. Wild land animals, mammals, make up for only 3% of the Earth's animal biomass. And moreover, wildlife is undergoing currently the so-called sixth mass extinction. Current animal law is mostly, almost exclusively, on the national level. And currently, only half of the states of the world have some legislation about animals, sometimes only prohibiting animal cruelty. Around 100 states of the world have some legislation. That also means that 100 states have no legislation at all. In the first chapter of the book, I posit as a starting point the observation that in our globalized world, virtually all aspects of human and animal interactions possess a transboundary dimension. And I will give you some few examples only. Meat, dairy, leather, wool, and all other animal-derived products are made in global supply chains. Moreover, the consumption of animal products is rising due to a growing demand of consumers in developing states. And as you know, animal food is extremely resource intensive. According to the Food and Agriculture Organization, 26% of the terrestrial surface is used for grazing animals. And that causes, of course, also an enormous erosion, as you can see on the slide. European animals need so much fodder that the fodder cannot be grown in Europe. It must be imported, notably from Latin America. About 80% of the world's soybeans are fed to animals. And also, this food production is being globalized. And of course, livestock transport, and in much smaller numbers, also pets are transported across countries, and they are shipped overseas, and they are here also exposed to extreme risks. On the slide, you see the cargo ship Queen Hind, which capsized in 2019 in the Black Sea off the Romanian coast, and more than 14,000 sheep drowned. Another example or fact is that global warming is induced by the abundance of cattle waste. According to the International Panel on Climate Change, livestock on managed pastures and rangelands accounted for more than half of the total anthropogenic N2O emissions from agriculture. Wildlife poaching finances armed conflict, notably in Africa, sustained by global criminal networks and illegal markets spanning to Asia. The global overexploitation of fish stocks makes local fishermen lose their livelihood, and this fuels piracy off the African coasts. And finally, the loss of genetic information through the extinction of species concerns all mankind. To conclude, that's the conclusion of chapter 1, animal use contributes to problems of a global nature and in global proportions: ecological damage, the extinction of species, human poverty, malnutrition, organized crime, and war. Besides the globalized nature of animal uses and their global social and ecological consequences, there is another reason why a regulatory response needs to be global. Namely, the threat that the relevant industries, will move to production sites with low animal welfare standards, this pressures the lawmakers and risks, in the extreme case, to trigger a race to the bottom. I give you two examples on the slide. In the German debate on a federal bill seeking to terminate and prohibit the widespread practice of shredding male chicken of the laying hen breeds, both the German Minister of Agriculture and the government stated that a blanket ban would risk driving hatcheries into foreign countries, and therefore such a regulation was not recommended, and in result the bill was dropped. The second example is the piglet castration without anesthesia. Here, German political factions supported the repeated postponement of a phasing out of this cruel practice because this, they claim, would be a competitive disadvantage for the German farmers, that the business would migrate and that jobs would be lost in Germany. And therefore, the amendment to the Animal Welfare Act, which was supposed to terminate the practice, was postponed and was postponed again and was postponed again to give farmers more time to convert their production modes. The upshot is that human-animal interactions creates ethical, ecological, and social problems of a global nature, and global problems require global policy responses. And law is one component of such policies. This means that the regulation of animal issues must transcend national boundaries. However, here we face a huge gap. If we look at the existing legal rules on the various levels of governance, national, regional, and international levels, we can identify three pillars: animal species conservation regimes, animal welfare norms, and animal rights. Current international hard law treaties form only the first pillar, and they are concerned almost exclusively with the conservation of a small subset of animal species, so they are concerned with groups. In contrast, the second pillar, the welfare of individual animals, is directly addressed only in national law, in EU law, and in international soft law, and very rarely in an ancillary fashion in some conservation treaties. And the third pillar, animal rights, these have so far been recognized only in court decisions in Argentina, Colombia, India, and Pakistan, but they have not been addressed in international law. To sum up, animal welfare and animal rights are so far addressed almost exclusively on the national level and not in public international law proper. So that means that in order to fully analyze the legal landscape, we need a global law approach. And by global law approach, I mean an approach covering both state-made and non-state-made rules on the domestic level, on the local, regional, and international levels. And speaking of a global animal law conveys the message that we need to have an eye on these various layers of law and on the various norm types. In chapter 2 of the book, I give an overview of the international rules that exist on animals. On the slide, you see the burning of confiscated elephant tusks in Kenya, in the Nairobi National Park. The ivory represents a stock confiscated amounting to the tusks of about 6,700 elephants, and it was worth an estimated black market value of 150 to 220 million US dollars. The confiscations were performed in application of CITES, the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species. However, the species conservation treaties, such as CITES, consider wild animals as natural resources. Animal welfare is not at all part of the sustainable use narrative. And the focus of international hard law on wildlife and on species conservation results in a disconnect between animal welfare and international regulation. And this is what is meant by animal welfare gap in international law. Chapter 3 of the book zooms in on one particular species conservation regime, the Whaling Convention. This convention protects whales as a global resource, at most as a so-called common concern of humankind. But this legal status does not prohibit the whale's sustainable exploitation. The Whaling Commission, even in its bold arrogation of powers and in extension of its mandate in the direction of species protection, has never asserted a whale's right to life, but rests concentrated on species protection as opposed to whale individuals. The only individualist aspect of the Commission's work is whale welfare to be protected, notably in decisions on humane killing. This is a far cry from a right to life. So the key question is whether the regime can lawfully further evolve to improve the fate of whales, or whether such a development would be ineffective and illegitimate. Currently, there is a cleavage in the Whaling Commission among the membership between pro-whaling states, notably Norway and Iceland on the one side, and anti-whaling states and environmental NGO observers on the other side. And this prevents consensual decision-making without formal voting. Moreover, Japanese scientific whaling, until the Japanese withdrawal from the convention in 2019, is a problem, and also the Russian and Norwegian objections against the moratorium on commercial whaling, and also the Icelandic reservation. All this is circumventing the rules of the convention. Japan's recent denunciation will not likely bring the regime to collapse, I would say, but the Japanese exit from the convention looks maybe like just one manifestation of a broader revolt of non-Western states against international law as being one-sided and not reflecting their interests. So one could ask whether the non-participation of the worst states is a death blow to the legal regime. What's the use of a whaling treaty that binds only those states which do not hunt whales anyway? I think that the continuous value of the regime stems exactly from the fact that the major threats to whales have changed from international hunting to bycatch and to accidents in fishing gear and to ocean pollution, global warming, and other systemic problems. And these novel threats make a convention with a broad membership, including non-whaling nations, all the more necessary. Japan's withdrawal might even have the salutary effect of ending the constant rumors about vote buying in the treaty bodies, and might therefore restore faith in the procedural legitimacy of the regime. And also, the withdrawal of Japan will probably put to rest the attempts to overturn the moratorium against commercial whaling. Overall, the conclusion of this chapter is that the Whaling Convention has proven to be a living instrument which has been and should continue struggling to allow whales to live peacefully. Chapter 4 deals with European Union law. The EU is the most important global player on animal welfare. The welfare of live animal products does not figure as one of the Union's values in the TEU, and animal welfare is no independent policy area, but the EU possesses an implicit power to administer animal welfare, ancillary to its power in the area of agriculture and ancillary to its power to establish an internal market, and both are shared competences with the member states. Legislation on animal welfare and on animals has been chiefly adopted under the heading of the Common Agricultural Policy, or as an approximation of laws for the functioning of the internal market. And the EU institution mainly occupied with animal welfare politics is the General Directorate Santé. It has a unit G2 which carries the title Animal Health and Welfare. And there is also the European Food Safety Authority, seated in Parma, which deals with animal welfare and also hosts an animal health and welfare panel. Secondary lawmaking by the EU, around 20 legal acts, is dominated by the market logic. In 2007, with the Treaty of Lisbon, an animal welfare mainstreaming clause, Article 13 TFEU, has been adopted, but this clause has only reinforced the paradox of the legal status of the animals as a sentient being that can be killed, as a sentient merchandise. Actual strategic policy making on animal welfare started only in 2006. There was a community action plan and then a European Union strategy for the protection and welfare of animals until 2015. The Court of Auditors has audited that and found that there were delays for most of the actions planned. And after 2015, no new strategy was adopted. Instead, the Commission created an EU animal welfare platform in 2017. The platform has 75 member states, NGOs, and business representatives, and it has a threefold task, namely to work towards better application of EU rules on animal welfare. Second, to develop and use voluntary commitments by business to further improve animal welfare. And third, to promote EU animal welfare standards on the global markets. The choice towards pure enforcement and abandonment of new lawmaking was one-sided, and there are concerns that the new animal welfare platform is merely a talking shop. The Commission has so far only rarely prosecuted non-compliant member states for infringements, but it has been intensifying its action since around 2012. The Court of Justice of the European Union has so far issued more than 30 judgments involving animal welfare. The most frequent topics are live animal transports, followed by disease control through vaccination, and other topics are humane slaughter, food labeling, and animal experiments. And the court has begun to emphasize the ethical rationale of the secondary legislation besides the economic rationale. In the recent case law, the legal principle of animal welfare serves as a factor in the proportionality analysis for assessing the conformity of secondary law of the Union with European fundamental rights, for example, in religious slaughter. The animal welfare clause is used even as a standalone legal benchmark sometimes, and it is most often used as a guideline for the interpretation of secondary union law. For example, in the recent judgment prohibiting France from allowing glue trapping birds. The change of EU membership, with the traditionally very animal-friendly United Kingdom having left the Union, and the more recent membership of Eastern European states with a less clear record of animal protection on the one hand and weaker economies on the other hand, does not favor animals in Europe. And on top, the European agricultural operators are increasingly under the pressure of competition on the global market. And therefore, the chapter concludes that in this constellation, it's all the more important to carve out with juridical arguments how the Union's responsibility towards animals already forms part of the legal acquis européen. The fifth chapter deals with international trade. Actually, there are 5 main threats for national and European Union animal welfare measures. The first threat is that the operators in high standard states risk to lose export markets for their relatively expensive products, while direct payments and export subsidies are strictly regulated or are prohibited by the international agreements. Secondly, the high standard states are menaced by outsourcing of animal production. We've heard that argument on the chicken hatcheries moving to Ukraine. Thirdly, states are in a system of liberalized trade bound to allow low standard imports, which then compete with the domestic, more animal-friendly products. A typical consumer response to rising prices triggered by animal welfare requirements is then the turn to cheap and substandard products. For example, after the United Kingdom had banned gestation crates for pigs in 1999, the import of pork increased by 77%. Fourthly, the international trade rules restrict the domestic policy spaces to implement animal welfare strategies, because animal welfare strategies are first of all conceived as a trade barrier, and any measure suspected to run against the liberalization telos must, of course, as you know, be specifically justified and must be shown to be covered by one of the GATT exceptions under GATT or other treaties. And fifth and finally, trade liberalization has indirect consequences for animal welfare because notably lower tariffs on feed grain allows for the importation of grains and thus contributes to the spread of factory farming. For example, China's decision to cut tariffs on the import of soybeans in order to meet the conditions of WTO accession has vastly reduced the cost of animal feeds, and this was integral to the surge in pig factory farming since 2006. For all these reasons, we can say that as a matter of principle, international trade is a chiller for animal welfare laws and policies. The WTO seal products dispute was a watershed which might pave the way for future more dynamic interpretation of the exception clauses, especially Article 20 GATT. And in that case, it was the public morals exception which was used. The next question arising in the context of international trade law regimes is beyond merely upholding domestic national animal standards, how to disseminate such standards. And here the EU is an eminently important player because the EU animal welfare standards are higher than the standards of most of the trading partners, and the EU has economic leverage. And the EU is indeed actively seeking to disseminate its own animal welfare standards globally. So what has been called the Brussels effect can play out. And the EU may also campaign on the international plane for uniform international rules in order to level the playing field. And I submit in this chapter that this does not run against the theory of comparative advantage, because low standard states' insistence on that comparative advantage does not give a license to completely unbridled competition. Every market, including the global market in animal products, needs a regulatory frame. At some tipping point, competition becomes unfair. Although it's of course controversial where this tipping point lies in concrete constellations, some boundaries are consented. For example, although low wage levels are generally a competitive advantage, the WTO members do accept the ILO core labor standards. So similar to social dumping, we might speak of animal welfare or ethics dumping in some contexts. The trading nations could subscribe to core animal welfare standards, which could then function as a regulatory framework inside which the world's agriculture and food market plays. Such harmonization could proceed in 3 stages, starting with isolated animal welfare clauses in trade agreements over bilateral and regional animal welfare treaties for specific sectors, to maybe in the end a multilateral agreement on animal welfare. And the first stage is already reached with the new generation regional and bilateral free trade agreements. Many of these agreements, notably by the EU, contain animal welfare clauses that could be proactively used. At the beginning of the millennium, the EU Commission, for example, had contemplated the negotiation of agreements in specific sectors, for example, the trade in eggs, with the EU's major trading partners. And the chapter concludes that it is time to revive such diplomatic initiatives. Chapter 6 deals with armed conflict. Animals are war's other victims. War is a killer for wildlife, and war also affects livestock and companion animals, and it's worst for zoo animals. The chapter discusses the protection of these various groups of animals under international humanitarian law as it stands. And it finds that legal obligations towards animals under the law as it stands are weak. The chapter also explores the legal options for more animal-friendly conception of the law of armed conflict. A reinterpretation of some rules would help, but is not enough. The Martens Clause opens a window for the development of new rules. A first step could be to build consensus around some principles which might attract easy approval. For example, a principle of decent treatment of sentient animals in armed conflict. This could be acknowledged, and this could limit cruelty against animals in armed conflict. De lege ferenda, the regime on environmental protection could be complemented by stricter rules on respecting and rebuilding the environment, with a special focus on habitat and animals. And a model for this is the ongoing work of the International Law Commission on Protection of the Environment in Armed Conflict. Additional rules could be adopted in special agreements or by unilateral pledges by armed groups. A special problem are the animals used as military tools. In World War I, 8 million horses died, and in World War II, still, the Soviet Union used 21 million horses, 1/3 of them died. Today, still, camels are used, mules, dolphins, and sea lions, and the most frequent animals are dogs. On the slide, you see a US Army dog captured by Taliban in Afghanistan. The war animals are currently treated as mere objects under international humanitarian law. The presumption of a civilian as opposed to a military quality of such dogs also applies to the animals. They are, as civilian objects, protected pragmatically and quite well. A key problem is, however, the employment of the animals by humans, which can then transform the animals into military objects. And as soon as an animal makes a military contribution, it crosses the line from civilian to military, and it can then be targeted just like a tank or a truck or an ammunition fabric. I submit that this legal consequence is profoundly unfair because it does not take into account the animal's nature as sentient beings. And I argue that it would be adequate to qualify animals making direct and effective military contributions as animal weapons and ban their use completely. The chapter concludes that in the zoopolis, the first political right of animals would be the right not to take part in human wars. Chapter 7 deals with animal rights. On the slide, you see the chimpanzee Cecilia. She was recognized to be a non-human legal person by the Argentinian judge. And she was liberated from a zoo with a writ of habeas corpus. The chapter argues that the recognition of international legal animal rights is conceptually sound and would be in normative terms desirable. We know that animal rights face important ethical and doctrinal objections. And I think that these are serious, but that they are outweighed by the symbolic and practical advantages of rights. I think that some animals need some rights, and they should receive legal rights, not because and to the extent that the animals are like us, because rights are not a prize for being almost as smart or compassionate as we are, but animals should be recognized because animal rights should be recognized because animals need them for good reasons. And the most important reason is the shift of the fallback rule and the obligation to justify harming animals. The default rule would shift from the entitlement of humans to employ and exploit animals in all conceivable ways to a zone of protection of animals' basic needs and interests, which would be the starting point of the legal reasoning. And this argument shifting potential of animal rights is akin to the discursive and reflexive justification of moral human rights as espoused, for example, by Rainer Forst. It's, however, not exactly the same argument because the obligation to justify the curtailment of animal rights does not arise towards the animals themselves, but rather towards other humans who possess the capacity of practical reasoning and to participate in the normative discourse. The animals can never understand the justification, but they feel the consequences. For sure, the concept of rights will change by its application to animals, but this is not inevitably a bad thing, because the rightlessness of animals is only a legal convention working in support of the status quo of ruthless and cruel exploitation. And this convention is not coincidental, but it flows from and it fortifies the moral, political, and social choices that have been made. But these choices can be reversed. If we want to fit animal rights as a new type of rights into the traditional branches of the law, the best match seems to be public law and not private law, because the point is not to capacitate actors to shape their interactions on a market, for example, by concluding contracts like business, but to protect persons against the overwhelming legal and physical power of the state apparatus. Although, of course, as I said at the beginning, most animals on the planet are under private ownership and suffer from the treatment of private actors, this situation is upheld by state regulation, for example, by the law of property, and the true addressee is therefore the state. Of course, rolling out animal rights on a larger scale would be no magic bullet. Practically speaking, even without any rights, the animals' lives and deaths would be enormously improved if protection standards were introduced in more states and if the shocking implementation deficits were remedied. These would be enormously useful practical steps. But the symbolic value of animal rights might have the deeper and longer lasting effect, if only indirectly. It would transform our interactions with animals from a culture of authority to a culture of justification. The chapter concludes that the acknowledgement of legal animal rights would be symbolic legislation in its best sense. The starting point of the book has been the insight that the predicament of animals which everywhere suffer from humans is a global issue. And the analysis has revealed that international law falls short on three fronts and even creates problems. First, there is a welfare gap. Second, priority is given to species protection at the expense of animal individuals. And third, international law risks to choke national animal welfare measures. The study also tried to show that the law has up to now been and will probably always be profoundly ambivalent for animals, because the law has the power to condone and perpetuate massive and large-scale violence committed on animals. And the investigation has also shown how facially neutral legal provisions, for example, trade law, and even species conservation law, works to the detriment of animals or of certain groups of animals. And reacting to these three shortcomings, the concluding chapter identifies some new directions for further development of the law. And an institutional hub for this could be the OIE, which you see on the slide, a window in the hall. This is the Office International des Epizooties. It was founded in 1924 and it is seated in Paris. It was founded to combat zoonoses like COVID-19. We can't ignore that there are enormous economic obstacles against animal welfare measures. And where human interests are antagonists to animal welfare, reconciliation and trade-offs must be sought. The history, for example, of the universal outlawing of child labor shows that a protective regime can be established and that it can be established even against economic interest and that it can, as a matter of principle, work. Norm creation, of course, requires a mix of strategies ranging from consumer action over strategic litigation to international trade sanctions. And it first of all depends on the development of a new ethics. And such an ethics can build on the existing global justice discourse, on the animal rights discourse, on the discourse about ecological interdependence of humans and animals in nature, and on post-humanism. Actually, the anthropocentric arguments in favor of reform and reduction of animal exploitation are quite powerful because, as I said at the beginning, animal use causes and exacerbates a string of per se global problems for humans, ranging from global warming over land erosion to water shortage to organized crimes. So different arguments can be used and they can appeal to different audiences and they might contribute to building an overlapping consensus on the proper treatment of animals. And on such a potential global overlapping consensus, new international rules on animal protection could build. We know, of course, that the normativity of international law is especially thin. I would like to variate Hirsch Lauterpach's dictum that, I quote Lauterpach, If international law is in some ways the vanishing point of law, then an international animal law would perhaps even more conspicuously be at the vanishing point of international law. And finally, of course, more law is not in itself the solution for the global animal issue. The law will probably never make the most decisive impact next to other factors, notably the profit interest in the context of a global capitalism. However, the law is itself not only shaped by the economic, social, and cultural preferences and interests, but the law in turn shapes those factors too. Law is therefore a necessary, but not a sufficient condition for improving the fate of animals. And as in all other areas of law, specifically international law, it is to be expected that enforcement will be the Achilles heel. However, the relative weakness and ambiguity of the law should not condemn legal scholars to resignation. International law is not only a hollow hope, but can be made a force for good for animals. What we need is a deeper, much broader, and indeed global animal protection through law, a building block for global justice for animals.